I'd like to talk about why eligibility is a key consideration when pursuing the employee retention tax credit. It's a very large credit for 2020, up to 50% of up to $10,000 in wages per employee. So $5,000 max possible per employee in 2020. And in 2021, it's 70% of up to $10,000 in wages per employee per quarter. So it can be a very, very large credit. And while the basic determination of eligibility seems simple on the surface, either meeting a gross receipts test or meeting a government shutdown test, there is significant nuance to it, especially in relation to rules pertaining to aggregation, rules pertaining to partial government shutdown. There are lots of different scenarios and lots of different industries where it's difficult to tell right off the bat whether a company really is eligible via partial shutdown. So because the credit is so large, we really want to make sure that we take the time to understand our business, understand our industry, understand all the rules that relate to ERTC before we then go ahead and say, yes, we're eligible. Because the last thing we want to do is take a very significant credit and then realize down the line that we're not eligible and face a penalty. So if you'd like a more in-depth resource video on understanding eligibility, I'd like to refer you to one of our other ERTC managers, Ian Williams, who's done a video specifically on eligibility considerations. There are several considerations you should make before having your payroll provider process ERTC, or if they're a large provider, I know some of them are referring it to as flipping the switch on the ERTC credit. But it's important to understand that the liability for determining eligibility is on the company itself. And things that you should consider are, one, as we discussed, first, make sure you're eligible. The second thing to consider is your employee threshold count. So there are certain thresholds for the 2020 credit and the 2021 credit, by which if your company has greater than that threshold in full-time employees in 2019, the amount of the wages that are qualified and the healthcare costs that are qualified to use towards ERTC are limited to those employees that did not perform service. These thresholds are 100 full-time employees in 2019 for the 2020 credit and 500 full-time employees in 2019 for the 2021 credit. So before you just go ahead and designate that, oh yes, we met the eligibility test, we met the government shutdown test, or we met the gross receipts test, it's also important to make sure that you have the correct number of full-time employee headcount for 2019. And this is an area where, again, it's very important to consider aggregation rules, because if you are forced to aggregate with additional companies under common control, you have to make sure that you are including the full-time employee count for the aggregated group as a whole. The next thing to consider is whether or not you had PPP draws, PPP1 or PPP2. While the law retroactively changed on December 27th of 2020 to allow a company to be eligible for both ERTC and PPP, you still cannot use the same wages in PPP forgiveness and ERTC. It is also important to note that if both are used, ERTC, the credit, the wages used for the credit, would take precedence over those wages being used in PPP forgiveness. And under audit, you could be subjecting yourself to the disallowance of a portion or all of your PPP forgiveness. This is an extremely important point because PPP forgiveness as a benefit is substantially greater than ERTC. So it's important to understand that taking advantage of PPP forgiveness should be your primary goal over taking ERTC. Now, it's definitely easy you can optimize both getting PPP and ERTC through various analysis of wages, but definitely before you have a payroll company just turn on the ERTC credit for you, you want to make sure that you understand the impact that potentially has on your PPP covered period. There's certain essential documentation I would recommend having in order to substantiate the credit. One, obviously, you want to have documentation substantiating which eligibility test you performed, whether it was the gross receipts test or the government shutdown test. If it's the gross receipts test, you want to make sure that you're performing the gross receipts test on the same basis as your tax return. And if it's the government shutdown test, then you want to have sufficient documentation backing up the specific municipal or statewide orders that you used in order to determine your eligibility. The next thing you should have is documentation of your full-time employee count for 2019. Because again, if you were greater than the 100 threshold for 2020 and greater than the 500 threshold for the 2021 credit, both looking back to 2019, then the wages and healthcare costs that are qualified are significantly reduced. So again, we want to make sure that we have good backup for our eligibility test, good backup determining that our full-time employee count for 2019. And with both of those includes good backup of any aggregation that we're required to uphold. So if we're part of a commonly controlled group, we want to make sure that we have documentation supporting that. And if we're not, we want to have documentation supporting that we weren't required to aggregate. And next, if we have PPP loans, then we want to have some kind of analysis and documentation should we be subject to audit that can show that we definitely segregated the wages that were used towards PPP forgiveness and ERTC, and that no wage that was used for ERTC was also used in PPP forgiveness, and vice versa. Those would be the basic, most important things to have documentation of. There are others, but those are the biggest ones that come to mind.